Night in the lowland jungle doesn't fall so much as it rises. Shadows crawl up the sides of stone pyramids, torches flicker on carved stairways, and somewhere in the distance, a conch shell horn echoes through humid air. Imagine standing in a crowded plaza, surrounded by tens of thousands of people, in a city you've never heard of, but which once rivaled the great capitals of the ancient world. If stories like this pull you in, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this kind of deep dive mystery. Now, let's listen to the story. Before those jungle cities fell silent and let the trees take over, they were loud, astonishingly loud. We're talking about the classic Maya world, roughly from 250 to 900 CE, in what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. No one walking through those plazas thought they lived in a disappearing civilization. To them, the future was carved in stone and painted in vivid reds, blues, and yellows. Picture Tikal at dawn. The first light seeps over the horizon, turning mist into a glowing veil. The tops of the pyramids poke above the jungle canopy, like stone ships in a green ocean. Spider monkeys shriek in the distance, birds call, and from the city's heart comes the steady thump of wooden pestles grinding maize into dough. The smell of smoke, roasted corn, and damp earth mixes into one of history's most underrated cultural perfumes. Down in the plazas, people are already moving. Women in finely woven huipiles walk with baskets balanced on their heads. Children chase each other between limestone steps, their laughter bouncing off temple walls. Scribes with black-stained fingers carry folded bark paper codices, the ancient equivalent of someone clutching a laptop and trying not to spill their coffee. Nobles in jade jewelry and feathered headdresses stride past, trying to look important and not trip over their own elaborate costumes. This wasn't a world of a few random pyramids dropped in the jungle. It was dense, organized, and surprisingly urban. For a long time, scholars underestimated just how urban. One surprising fact is that modern laser mapping, LiDAR, shows that some Maya regions were thick with cities, causeways, terraces, and fields far beyond what you'd guessed from a few lonely ruins poking through the trees. Whole landscapes were engineered, hills cut into steps for agriculture, swamps drained, reservoirs dug with careful planning. Inside the royal courts, kings and queens oversaw all of this with a theatrical flair that would put modern branding agencies to shame. Politics was performance. Rulers staged elaborate rituals in front of thousands. They wore towering headdresses, cloaks of jaguar skin, and belts decorated with carved obsidian blades. Drums boomed, incense smoke curled upward, and the crowd watched as their leaders literally embodied the link between humans, gods, and ancestors. Historians still argue about whether every detail of these public ceremonies was understood by the people in the back row, but no one doubts they felt the power of it. Education, in the Maya sense, meant learning the scripts and cycles that ordered the universe. Scribes and priests memorized complex calendars, the 260-day sacred cycle, the 365-day solar year, and immense counts of days stretching back to mythic origins. They could tell you which date was auspicious for planting, for marriage, for enthronement. If you've ever checked your horoscope just for fun, but still secretly wondered, you'd fit in right. And those glyphs, the writing, were everywhere. Carved on stelae in plazas, painted on ceramics, scratched into bones. For a long time, outsiders stared at them like an unsolved code. Now we know they recorded royal histories, alliances, wars, births, deaths, and sometimes wonderfully petty things like bragging about who captured whose relatives. Some locals in modern Maya communities swear their grandparents always said the old stones talked, while others roll their eyes and say that's just a romantic story people like to tell after the fact. The economy behind all this ceremony and stonework was huge. Maize, beans, squash, and cacao, chocolate, anchored everyday diets. But trade networks carried obsidian from volcanic regions, jade from distant mountains, shells from the coasts, and feathers from tropical forests. Canoes slipped along rivers, porters walked along white-plastered causeways. If you saw a noble shimmering in green jade and iridescent quetzal feathers, you were seeing not just wealth, but hundreds of miles of trade and obligation stitched into a single outfit. Inside homes, life mixed the familiar and the alien. Families slept in houses made of wood and thatch, with cacked earth floors swept smooth each morning. Cooking fires flickered, filling interiors with smoke and warmth. Kids probably did what kids always do: complain about chores, invent games, and ask too many questions at the worst possible time. The sounds of grinding corn, dogs barking, babies crying, and neighbors gossiping created a soundtrack that would feel oddly recognizable, even if the language didn't. Religion wrapped itself around everything. The Maya saw their world as layered: sky realms above, watery and earthy realms below, with the human world in between. Sacred trees, caves, and cenotes, natural sinkholes, were seen as portals. Priests read the movements of Venus and the moon, tracking eclipses with a precision that still impresses modern astronomers. One popular theory suggests that the ability to predict celestial events gave rulers a kind of cosmic authority. If you can promise the sun will return on schedule, people tend to listen when you talk. Of course, not everyone buys this story. Some scholars argue that political power rested more on alliances and warfare than on stargazing. Ball courts echoed with a thudding, rubbery sound as players smacked a heavy ball with their hips, knees, and elbows. The game was athletic, ritual, and political all at once. Watching it, you'd feel the tension in the air: cheers, gasps, the sharp intake of breath when the ball skimmed too close to a player's face. Think of a modern championship game, but with more incense and fewer commercials. From the outside, the classic Maya world might look like a row of isolated city-states. In reality, it was a web of alliances, rivalries, and dynastic marriages that would make any prestige TV show jealous. Kings sent their daughters to marry foreign lords, cementing alliances. Envoys carried coded messages along forest paths. Sometimes these relationships ended in feasts and gifts. Other times they ended in war. Researchers still disagree on how centralized or fragmented these political networks really were, but everyone agrees they were complicated. And above it all, the jungle never really went away. Even in the heart of a great city, you could hear the rustle of leaves and the calls of animals. Roots pushed against stone, lizards basked on carved steps, rain drummed on plastered walls. The Maya were experts at managing this environment, terracing hills, channeling water, building reservoirs that could sustain thousands through dry seasons. One little-known detail is that some of their reservoirs had carefully layered sediments and even water plants that helped keep the water cleaner, like ancient giant Brita filters. To people living there, the jungle was not just a backdrop, it was a partner and a threat, a source of life and a constant reminder that nature was watching. If the harvest went well, the city thrived. If it didn't, the margins between enough and not enough, between order and anxiety, grew thin. You can almost imagine the way a dry season felt in those plazas. The dust on bare feet, the tense glances at the sky, the quiet conversations by the reservoirs that suddenly seemed a little lower than last year. Yet in the centuries we call the classic period, the overall impression was one of confidence. Temples rose higher, Stelae multiplied. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, and many others carved their stories into stone as if they expected those stories to be read forever. No one chiseling glyphs into a monument thought in a few hundred years vines will crack this stone and howler monkeys will scream from the top. It's easy, knowing what comes later, to see every minor problem as a sign of doom. But for the people walking those plazas, the world felt intensely alive and full of possibility. Their kings still ruled, their gods still spoke through rituals, their markets still filled with goods. The jungle hummed at the edges, green and patient. The stone cities gleamed in the sun. And somewhere, beneath the everyday noise of grinding maize and echoing drums, tiny shifts, subtle changes in climate, politics.
By the time anyone in those plazas realized something was wrong, it didn't arrive as a single disaster. There was no booming voice from the sky, no fiery end-of-the-world special effects. Instead, the trouble came the way jungle vines crack stone, slowly, quietly, and then, all at once, everything looks different. At first, the signs were subtle. A dry season that seemed a little longer than usual. Reservoirs that didn't quite refill to the same reassuring level. Maize fields where the plants grow a bit shorter, leaves curling just enough to make farmers glance at the sky more often than they liked. The same sounds filled the cities, grinding maize, kids laughing, drums echoing, but beneath them ran a low hum of unease, like a background note you can't unhear once you notice it. In the royal courts, scribes still painted bright scenes of victories and rituals, but behind those scenes, conversations grew sharper. A city like Tikal didn't exist alone. It had rivals, most famously Calakmul, deep in the jungle to the north. You can imagine the tense meetings over carved wooden tables, messengers bringing news of alliances shifting, trade routes threatened, minor lords demanding favors in exchange for loyalty. If you've ever watched office politics unfold around a coffee machine, just scale up the drama, add feathered headdresses, and remove the HR department. The classic Maya world depended on rain in a way that was both sophisticated and fragile. They built reservoirs, canals, and terraces, turning the landscape into a giant water management system. For centuries, it worked beautifully. But evidence from lake sediments, those layers of mud that quietly archive climate history, suggests that at certain points, rainfall dipped, and not just for a single bad year. Some periods saw repeated droughts, spaced just close enough together to keep cities permanently on edge. Historians still argue about whether climate shifts were the main driver of what happened next, or just one piece in a larger, messier puzzle. Some point to chemical traces in those lake cores and say, look, here is the fingerprint of drying skies. Others counter that societies can survive drought if their political and social systems are flexible enough. In their view, the real story lies in how leaders responded or failed to respond when the rain faltered. Imagine being a Maya ruler during one of those tense years. Your legitimacy isn't just about taxes and soldiers. It's tied into the idea that you stand between your people and chaos. You perform rituals to call the rains. You time ceremonies to sacred calendars. You promise that the gods are listening. But what happens when you stand on a pyramid, incense smoke curling around you, and the clouds still refuse to gather? You can almost feel the weight of thousands of eyes in the plaza below, wondering quietly, is something off? One popular theory suggests that as droughts hit, rulers doubled down on monument building and spectacle, trying to prove their power just as their grip on the land was loosening. Stelae multiplied, temples rose higher, and the sheer labor poured into stone may have been, in part, a frantic attempt to project stability.
Of course, not everyone buys this story. Some researchers argue that construction actually slowed in certain regions as resources grew scarce. Either way, there's a tragic irony to the idea of carving ever grander stories into stone while the fields that fed your city were slowly failing. It wasn't just the weather and the kings. The cities themselves were locked in a complex dance of rivalry. Tikal and Calakmul clashed indirectly and directly, each trying to build networks of allies, smaller cities that pledged loyalty in exchange for protection, prestige, and trade bonuses. When one great power faltered, entire chains of dependent cities felt the shock. It's a little like when a major company collapses today, and suddenly dozens of smaller businesses discover that their biggest customer has vanished. Sometimes those rivalries turned into open conflict. Armies marched along jungle paths, obsidian blades glinted, captives were taken. But even here, the story isn't just about battles. It's about what prolonged instability does to a system that's already under environmental pressure. If your fields are thirsty, your reservoirs are low, and on top of that, your king is spending energy feuding with the neighbors, everyday life starts to feel like walking on a cracked stone staircase, hoping the next step will hold. Researchers still disagree on how militarized the classic Maya world really was. Some see the carved scenes of warriors and captives as evidence of constant warfare. Others argue that these images exaggerate conflict for propaganda, the ancient equivalent of posting only your best winning moments on social media. The truth likely lies somewhere between. Not non-stop chaos, but enough tension and fighting to make political life risky. Under all this, the environment was being pushed hard. Deforestation around major cities, needed for building, fuel, and agriculture, altered local ecosystems. Trees cut down meant less shade, more erosion, and sometimes reduced ability for soil to hold water. One little-known detail, in some regions, pollen records show sharp changes, suggesting forests gave way to more open, degraded landscapes near certain centers. In other words, the very success of the cities may have eaten away at the stability of the land that supported them. Imagine walking out from the heart of a city like Copan. At first you pass dense neighborhoods, small shrines, and busy paths. Then you move into fields and terraces, some carved into hillsides like giant staircases. But as time goes on and pressure mounts, those terraces might start to crumble. A big storm, a series of bad harvests, a landslide here, a failed reservoir there, each event small on its own, but together they stack up into a sense that the old ways of managing the landscape are fraying. Inside households, the stress likely showed up in subtle ways. Smaller meals, more reliance on backup crops, maybe more arguments over whose turn it was to haul water. The sound of grinding maize would still be there, but maybe the maize itself was a bit harder to come by. People are resourceful. They'd adjust as best they could, but adjustment has limits. At some point, you aren't just bending, you're breaking. Some locals today, descendants of the Maya who still live across the region, tell stories about ancient times when cities angered the gods or forgot proper respect for the land. They'll point at ruins and say, "This place rose too high," or "They stopped listening." Some locals swear these stories are real events, passed down for centuries in disguised form, while others roll their eyes and say people just like to attach morals to old stones. Whether literal or not, those tales capture a feeling that something in the relationship between people, power, and the environment went out of balance. There's a temptation to imagine a single turning point, one failed harvest, one lost war, one drought that pushed everything over the edge. But the evidence suggests something slower, messier. In some cities, building activity waned. In others, inscriptions stopped mid-dynasty, like someone closed a book in the middle of a chapter and never opened it again. Markets may have grown thinner, with fewer goods, fewer merchants, more worry. A trader who once walked proud with a pack of jade and cacao might now be carrying less, hearing more rumors of trouble in the next city over. And through it all, the jungle watched. The same green wall that had once been carefully pushed back by terraces and reservoirs waited at the edges. Seeds fell into cracks in plaster. Roots tested the strength of steps and walls. Monkeys still called at dawn. Birds still flashed through the canopy. Nature has no concept of empire. It just fills empty spaces. From the viewpoint of a single generation, the changes might have felt like a series of unlucky years, then unlucky decades. From our longer perspective, they look like cracks spreading through a grand, intricate structure: political, environmental, spiritual. No single crack brought the classic Maya world down, but together they primed those stone cities and crowded plazas for something almost unthinkable to the people grinding maize and watching the sky: a future in which the plazas would empty, the rulers would vanish from their temples, and the jungle, patient and relentless, would step in to reclaim what had once been cut away.
If you could stand in a Maya plaza at its height and then flick a switch to fast forward 200 years, the shock would feel almost physical. One moment, crowds, drums, incense, and royal processions. The next, only wind, vines, and the distant shriek of a howler monkey sounding like someone dragging a chair across the sky. The stone is the same, the carvings are the same, but the people, the heartbeat, are gone. Of course, history doesn't give us a neat time lapse. It gives us fragments. A final dated monument here, an unfinished building there, a last inscription that reads like the end of a sentence no one remembered to finish. From these clues, we know that change wasn't a sudden overnight event. It was more like watching a crowded market close one stall at a time, day after day, until one morning you realize almost everyone has quietly packed up and left. At Tikal, one of the giants of the classic Maya world, the great plazas show this in the record. For centuries, rulers carved their deeds into stelae, stacking date after date like beads on a string. Then, in the late 700s and early 800s, those carved dates thin out, stumble, and finally stop. The last stelae stand like someone's final text message before the phone dies. Historians still argue about whether the end came faster in some cities than others, or whether we're just missing pieces of the puzzle in the dirt. Meanwhile, farther south in Kapan, something quietly heartbreaking happened. One of the later rulers, often called Yak's Passage, undertook a wave of construction that looks, in hindsight, almost desperate. New monuments, a reshaped acropolis, a kind of architectural, look, everything is fine, even as cracks were forming beneath the surface. Then, almost abruptly, royal inscriptions cease. The last dated monument there feels like a curtain dropping mid-performance, the orchestra still holding a note that no one resolves. So what does it mean for a city to empty? It doesn't necessarily mean everyone vanished at once, or that the place turned into a ghost city overnight. Imagine instead that elite families began to drift away, to safer, more stable regions, to new centers that seemed to be doing better. Craftspeople followed trade, farmers followed water, younger generations married out. The markets grew thinner. The palaces, once crowded with attendants, became quieter. The sound of grinding maize didn't disappear immediately. It just moved, one household at a time, to other valleys and other towns. One popular theory suggests that as dynasties collapsed and warfare and drought combined, people simply voted with their feet. If the king couldn't protect trade routes, if the reservoirs didn't hold, if the rituals at the temples stopped working, as measured in rain and full granaries, then loyalty to that place became optional. Of course, not everyone buys this story. Some researchers argue that disease or internal unrest may have played larger roles than we can currently see in the archaeology. The frustrating thing about ruins is that they don't come with exit interviews. You can feel the abandonment most vividly in the little details archaeologists find. A grinding stone left where it last sat by a hearth,
a pot broken and not swept up, a house platform with signs of reuse, then neglect. Some locals in modern Maya communities say their elders told them never to live too close to the old stones, as if the ancient cities were powerful but dangerous neighbors. Some locals swear those warnings go back centuries, while others roll their eyes and say they're more about avoiding snakes than ghosts. Either way, the result was distance. The living people of later centuries often chose to settle near, but not inside, the old great centers. As the plazas thinned, the carefully choreographed rituals changed tone. Imagine a king stepping out onto a temple stair to perform a ceremony and seeing fewer people than his father did. Gaps in the crowd where once shoulder to shoulder villagers had stood. The drums still sound, but maybe they echo a little more. The incense still rises, but the smell of anxiety might just be as thick as the smoke. In some places, you get the sense of projects left hanging, temples whose final layers of stucco were never finished, carvings that stop abruptly. It's like walking into an office on a Monday morning and finding half-written emails on the screens, chairs pushed back, coffee cups still on desks, but no people. Something pulled them away before they completed the day's work. Researchers still disagree on how tightly synchronized this collapse was across the region. Some see it wave, moving roughly from the south to the north and west, a pattern of abandonment that suggests large-scale regional forces. Others see more of a patchwork, some cities fading while others hang on, adapting, shifting their political strategies, or simply benefiting from better local conditions. What's clear is that by around 900 CE, many of the great lowland centers that had once dominated Maya life were shadows of their former selves. While the big cities faltered, not everything vanished. Smaller communities carried on. People didn't stop being Maya just because the stele stopped. Languages evolved but persisted. Rituals changed but were not erased. This is one of those strange, lesser-known truths. The disappearance we talk about is really the unraveling of a particular political and urban system, not the literal vanishing of an entire people. It's a bit like saying the fall of Rome, as if Italians packed up and left Europe. Still, for the cities themselves, the change was dramatic. Without constant upkeep, plaster flakes off walls, roofs of wood and thatch rot and collapse, staircases chip, then crack, then crumble. A tree seed lodges in a tiny fault line of a temple, sends down a root, and slowly pries the stone apart. The process is slow, almost tender. If nature had a motto, it might be, "No rush, I've got time." Rain becomes both sculptor and accomplice. It runs down carved faces, softening features, pigments fade, blues and reds wash away. The once vibrant murals that shouted royal propaganda to the crowd become ghost images, then bare stone. The jungle soundtrack grows louder. Insects, birds, frogs, and that ever-present chorus of leaves rustling like whispered conversations. There's a weird, dark humor in imagining the first vines creeping up the sides of the grand temples, like nature is trying on the city's architecture, the way someone might try on a fancy coat they found in the back of a closet. "Nice stairs you've got here," the forest seems to say. "Would be a shame if I climbed all over them." In some locations, we have signs of people returning to the ruins generations later, using parts of them as ceremonial sites or sources of cut stone. A stairway might gain a small shrine. A toppled stele might be reused as a building block in a humbler structure. The relationship shifts. The old capital is no longer the blazing center of political power. It's a place of memory, of caution, of opportunity to borrow ready-made stones if you don't mind a few staring glyphs on the side. And what about the last child to leave a great city like Tikal or Calakmul, whoever they were? We don't know their name, their age, or the direction they walked. But you can picture them, maybe holding a parent's hand, glancing back one last time at towering pyramids rising above the trees. For them, it might not have felt like the end of a civilization. It may have just been a necessary move to a place with better soil, more reliable water, fewer problems. People rarely think we are living in a collapse. They think we are going somewhere better. Yet from our vantage point, centuries later, the effect is stark. Where there were once crowded marketplaces and echoing ball courts, there is now moss, roots, and birds. The great plazas emptied not with a bang, but with a slow, persistent erosion of confidence, resources, and people. The jungle, which had always been kept at arm's length by terraces and reservoirs and human effort, stepped in to take its old territory back. Stone by stone, step by step, the hills returned, though under the leaf litter the cities waited, buried but not gone for someone in another age to hack through the vines, stumble on a carved face in the dirt, and realize that the jungle had been hiding a vanished world in plain sight.
Centuries after those last families walked away, the jungle finished what it had started. Roots thick as a person's waist wrapped around staircases. Tree trunks grew straight out of temple roofs, and plazas turned into green bowls of leaves and shadows. If you'd wandered through then, you wouldn't have said, "Ah, yes, the famous ruins of a classic Maya city." You'd probably have said something more like, "Why does this hill have corners?" and swatted at a truly offensive number of mosquitoes. For the people who did still live in these regions, Maya descendants farming, hunting, and raising families, the old centers never vanished the way they did from European maps. They simply changed categories in the mental landscape. What had once been capitals of living kings became wakab places, sometimes sacred, sometimes avoided, sometimes both. A cluster of overgrown mounds might be called the place of the old ones, or where the stone lords sleep. Some locals swear their grandparents warned them not to wander too close because lights were seen there at night, while others roll their eyes and say the only lights anyone saw were from people sneaking off to meet their sweethearts. The stones themselves were useful in a hard-headed way. If you needed a nicely cut block for a new house, the abandoned city had plenty. In some areas, you can still see later structures made from recycled temple stones, glyphs turned sideways or upside down in walls and steps. It's a weird sight, the once sacred words of dynasties now serving as someone's doorstep or the base of a cooking hearth. At the same time, certain carved monuments, especially those with imposing faces or strange creatures, were left alone, as if people sensed that moving them might be pushing their luck. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they recorded Maya towns, languages, resistance, and conversion efforts. But the great classic cities they would have called ruins were already deep in the green, half swallowed. A few Spaniards wrote about mysterious ancient buildings glimpsed in the forest, arches at Uxmal, walls at Palenque, but they didn't grasp the full scale. Historians still argue about whether indigenous guides deliberately downplayed the ruins to keep sacred places from being desecrated, or whether the jungle simply did such a good job of hiding them that even nearby communities saw them as remote, occasional destinations rather than everyday landmarks. Meanwhile, Maya identity itself persisted stubbornly. People continued to speak Maya languages, maintain rituals, sometimes folded into Christian practices, and hold on to stories about cycles of time, places of power, and eras before the present one. The Spanish conquest reshaped politics, religion, and land ownership in painful ways, but it did not erase the deep sense that the land was layered, with older worlds just beneath the surface. When later Europeans would gush about discovering lost cities, they were, from an indigenous point of view, more like guests finally noticing the furniture in a house they'd barged into centuries late. As colonial centuries rolled on, the old cities slept under vines. Jaguar tracks padded across buried staircases. Ceiba trees, the great sacred trees of Mesoamerica, sent roots into temple platforms. Rain, patient and relentless, slipped through cracks and widened them. Bats hung in the dark chambers that once amplified royal voices. One little-known detail: in some collapsed buildings, archaeologists later found stalactites forming inside, like miniature cave systems growing in man-made rooms. Nature calmly overwriting architecture drip by drip. Then, in the late 18th and especially the 19th century, outsiders began to push more aggressively into the forests. Not just conquerors or missionaries, but surveyors, adventurers, and would-be scientists. They were often led by local Maya guides who already knew of old places in the forest. The pattern repeated over and over. A foreign traveler writes in their journal about hacking through dense vegetation, sweating through their clothes, being bitten by everything with teeth, and then suddenly stumbling into a clearing where a carved face or staircase emerges from the green. Cue dramatic sketching and sometimes equally dramatic exaggeration. One popular story, told and retold in different forms, has a traveler asking a local a name for a ruin. The guide, trying to be polite or maybe a bit amused, gives a word that later becomes famous in guidebooks. Of course, not everyone buys this story. Linguists point out that some of those mysterious site names might be misunderstandings, nicknames, or even colonial-era labels rather than original ancient names. Still, it captures the sense of two knowledge systems brushing against each other. One ancient and local, rooted in stories, and one newly arrived, eager to label, measure, and publish. In the 1840s, for example, the writer John Lloyd Stephens and the artist Frederick Catherwood traveled through the region, visiting Copan, Palenque, Uxmal, and other sites. They didn't find these places in the sense of first discovery. Local people were already perfectly aware of them, but they did make them famous in Europe and the United States. Catherwood's careful drawings showed readers back home towering temples, intricate glyphs, and eerie faces peering from the jungle. For a public used to thinking of the Americas as culturally young compared to Egypt or Greece, these images were a jolt. Stephens, for his part, wrote vividly about clambering up ruins covered in trees, brushing moss and insects off carved stones, and realizing that an entire city lay beneath his boots. You can feel the same startled awe as in our opening image. The moment you realize the hill is actually a pyramid, and the roots around you grew over someone's courtyard. He was ahead of many of his contemporaries in insisting that the ancestors of the living Maya had built these cities, not some vanished race that mysteriously disappeared. Still, the romantic phrase "lost cities" stuck. It sounded good, even if it quietly erased the people still living nearby. Researchers still disagree on how much continuous memory linked specific ruins to specific ancient names and dynasties. Some argue that oral traditions, though transformed, preserved echoes of where certain powers once lay. Others suggest that while the idea of ancient stone cities persisted, the detailed knowledge of which king ruled where and when naturally faded across the centuries, the way most of us today don't know who built that old church downtown. Either way, it's clear that in many cases, when foreign explorers arrived, they walked into landscapes that were not empty, but layered with meanings they only partly understood. Those early expeditions weren't always gentle. Walls were cleared abruptly, vegetation burned, stones moved. Graffiti and Latin letters appear beside centuries-old glyphs. In some cases, explorers even tunneled into pyramids or dismantled parts of structures to get at buried chambers. the archaeological equivalent of jumping straight to the last chapter of a book by ripping the spine open. To be fair, they were working without modern standards and methods, but there's a bittersweet humor in the idea that careful hieroglyphic inscriptions survived 1,000 years of rain and jungle, only to be scratched over by someone with a 19th century pocket knife. Back in Europe and North America, the reports fed imaginations. Newspapers and books spoke of jungle-covered metropolises and civilizations swallowed by nature. Some writers couldn't resist adding ghost stories, glowing lights, strange noises at night, curses on those who disturbed the sights. Some locals swear that workers clearing ruins would often refuse to stay after dark because of footsteps and whispers among the stones, while others roll their eyes and say the only whispers were from people complaining about the mosquitoes. As more sites were mapped, Tikal, Calakmul, Carol, and countless smaller centers, something important began to happen in scholarship. The classic Maya world shifted in the foreign mind from a handful of isolated ruins to a dense network of once living cities. The lost landscape slowly came into focus. LiDAR in recent decades would push this even further, revealing causeways, terraces, and hidden structures under the canopy in almost shocking numbers. What had looked like a few lonely teeth of stone in a green jaw turned out to be entire skulls buried in foliage. Yet even as the scientific picture sharpened, the emotional tone remained haunted. To walk through a place like Tikal at dawn now, temples rising above the jungle, mists curling around carved masks. By the time the 20th and 21st centuries rolled around, the old Maya cities were no longer just eerie backdrops for travel sketches and ghost stories. They were crime scenes. Not in the who swung the sword sense, but in the forensic, what exactly happened here, and why did the suspects all leave sense? The jungle, the stones, even the mud at the bottom of lakes became witnesses. Modern scientists arrived with notebooks, GPS units, drones, and the quiet determination of people who are very used to not getting clear answers on the first try. If the early explorers were like people stumbling into a dark room with candles, modern researchers are the ones flipping on new kinds of flashlights. One of the brightest is LiDAR, laser scanning from the air. In simple terms, a plane or helicopter fires millions of laser pulses at the ground. Most bounce off leaves. Some sneak between branches and hit the surface below. Computers then subtract the trees and leave a bare-bones 3D map of what's under the canopy. The first time LiDAR maps of Maya regions started rolling in, archaeologists had a collective "wait, what?" moment. Places they thought they knew suddenly revealed hidden suburbs, terraces, causeways, and defensive walls. That hill with corners we talked about before turned into entire neighborhoods of such hills, house platforms, minor temples, irrigation works everywhere. One surprising fact? In some regions, the density of settlement was so high that what had looked like scattered ceremonial centers turned out to be parts of sprawling urban landscapes, more like low-rise garden cities than isolated temple complexes. This had a big implication for the mystery. If more people lived in these landscapes than previously thought, then the system was both more impressive and more delicate. More mouths to feed meant more pressure on land and water, and a bigger shock when things went wrong. Suddenly, the collapse wasn't just a few royal courts toppling. It was a whole, densely populated human-made ecosystem being pushed past its limits. While LiDAR was revealing the shape of the world above ground, another group of scientists was quietly interrogating mud. Lakes and reservoirs near former Maya cities hold layers of sediment like pages in a diary. Each year, a bit more silt settles to the bottom, trapping pollen, ash, minerals, and sometimes microscopic clues about drought and deforestation. By pulling up long cores of this mud and slicing them layer by layer, scientists can reconstruct centuries of environmental change. Some cores show clear signals of deforestation, pollen from forest trees dropping as pollen from crops and weedy plants rises. Then, around the time many cities faltered, you see evidence of drying, less water, more indicators of dust and burning, changes in the chemistry that point to repeated droughts. Historians still argue about whether these droughts hit everywhere at the same time or in overlapping waves, and about how severe they really were, but very few now doubt that climate stress was part of the story, pushing an already stretched system closer to the edge. Meanwhile, epigraphers, the specialists who read the glyphs, were having their own revolution. For centuries, outsiders looked at Maya writing as mysterious symbols, more decorative than practical. Then, through a mix of brilliant insights and slow, patient work, scholars cracked major parts of the code. Suddenly, those stelae and stairways were no longer just gorgeous, they were chatty. They talked of births, accessions, alliances, wars, rituals, and sometimes the awkwardness of dynastic drama. It turned out that far from being a peaceful, calendar-obsessed culture living in harmony with the jungle, the classic Maya world had political tensions and conflicts worthy of a modern docuseries. Inscriptions mention Star Wars, attacks time to specific astronomical events, and boast of capturing rival lords. You can almost hear the royal PR voice. On this auspicious day, our glorious king did in fact win. Epigraphy added a timeline to the environmental story. Dates of defeats, breaks in dynastic succession, and sudden political silences can be compared with lake mud records and construction histories. One popular theory suggests that when drought conditions hit and trade routes were unstable, rivalries between cities intensified, leading to more destructive conflicts at the worst possible time. Of course, not everyone buys this story. Some researchers think we might be reading too much into propaganda texts that exaggerate warfare while underestimating slower internal issues like class tensions or religious crises. Bioarchaeologists joined the investigation by studying human remains, by analyzing chemical signatures in bones and teeth, things like oxygen and carbon isotopes. They can infer diet and mobility. In some regions, evidence suggests the diets changed over time, hinting at nutritional stress or shifts from diverse foods to more restricted staples. Traces in bones can even show whether someone grew up locally or moved from somewhere else, turning skeletons into maps of ancient movement. It's a little like checking where the ingredients in your lunch came from, except your lunch is a person and it lived over 1,000 years ago. There's also the question of social inequality. In richly furnished tombs and elite compounds, the remains of nobles show different diets and health profiles than those of ordinary people buried elsewhere. That's not unique to the Maya, of course. History is very consistent about the wealthy eating better. But if, in times of stress, the gap widened sharply, the system might have become more brittle. When a crisis hits, and most people feel they're carrying the weight while elites keep building monuments, loyalty can fray. Some locals swear their elders' stories about cities that forgot the poor are echoes of that imbalance, while others roll their eyes and say that's just a timeless complaint you can attach to any era. Not all the clues are grand. Archaeologists have found household trash heaps that thin out over time, suggesting fewer people or fewer goods. Burn layers in some buildings point to episodes of violence or deliberate destruction. In others, the absence of such layers suggests more peaceful abandonment. Researchers still disagree on how often cities fell with a fight versus simply being walked away from when the cost of staying outweighed the benefits. When you put all these lines of evidence together, LiDAR maps, lake cores, glyph translations, bones, ceramics, soil chemistry, you don't get a single smoking gun. You get a tangle. Environmental stress from drought and deforestation, political instability and warfare, over-reliance on maize in some areas, making communities more vulnerable to crop failures, social inequality that may have made it harder to respond flexibly when things went wrong. One of the strangest and oddly comforting conclusions is that there is no neat villain in this story. There's no single day to circle on a calendar and write, "This is when the classic Maya disappeared." Instead, there's a long, complicated unwinding of a system that had been brilliantly successful for centuries. It's like watching a very complicated machine run slightly too hot for too long. By the time important gears start seizing up, the damage is already deep inside. And yet, through all this forensic science, one key fact sits quietly at the center. The Maya people did not vanish. Their political world changed, their great lowland capitals were abandoned, but their descendants are very much alive, speaking Maya languages, weaving patterns that echo ancient motifs, and sometimes working right alongside archaeologists in those jungle clearings. The disappearance the sensors and shovels are trying to explain is not the end of a people, but the transformation of their cities and power structures. There's a certain humility in watching laser scans sweep across a landscape while a local guide casually mentions a story they heard as a child about the old stones where the lords once lived. Modern technology can measure terraces and reservoirs down to centimeters, and still that simple phrase carries a weight the data alone can't. The jungle shadows hold numbers and memories. Science, in all its methods, lasers, mud, bones, glyphs, has pulled the classic Maya collapse out of the realm of pure myth into a realm of overlapping, testable explanations. But it hasn't stripped away the mystery entirely. There are gaps in the LiDAR coverage, gaps in the sediment cores, gaps in the inscriptions where stone was broken or never carved. Between those gaps lives a lingering uncertainty that refuses to completely go away. Standing today on a cleared temple top, with jungle stretching in every direction, you're looking at a place that's been mapped, sampled.
Stand in a Maya plaza today, one that's been cleared of trees but still ringed by jungle. And it's hard not to feel the weight of two timelines at once. On one side, tourists with cameras, guides with laser pointers, archaeologists with clipboards. On the other, an echo of bare feet on stone, the smell of fresh tortillas, the rustle of embroidered cotton and jade. The stone under your shoes is old enough to have seen both worlds, and it has very politely refused to explain itself to either. For a long time, people talked about the mysterious disappearance of the classic Maya, as if a whole civilization just got up and walked off stage in unison. It makes for a great book title, but the reality is more complicated, and in its own way, more powerful. Because when you look closely, you start to see that what disappeared was not the Maya themselves, but a particular way of organizing their world. Sprawling lowland capitals, divine kings, rigid hierarchies, and an urban system stretched tight over a challenging landscape. The people didn't evaporate. They moved, adapted, and kept going. In the centuries after the great cities emptied, population centers shifted north to places like Chichen Itza and later Mayapan, and into the highlands and other regions. Political forms changed. Fewer god-on-a-pyramid rulers with mile-long titles, more councils, more city-states with different power-sharing arrangements. Religion changed too, but far more slowly than conquerors like to believe. Ancient gods were folded into new saints. Old rituals slipped under new names. Walk through modern Maya towns today, whether in Guatemala's highlands, Yucatan's villages, or Belize's communities, and you will hear Maya languages. See textiles whose patterns echo ancient motifs, and find festivals where people still mark cycles of days in ways that would feel oddly familiar to their classic-era ancestors. Some locals swear they can look at a carved figure on a stela and recognize postures, hairstyles, even ways of standing that remind them of their own grandparents, while others roll their eyes and say, "You're seeing what you want to see." Either way, there's a line of continuity that the word disappearance completely misses. So why do we cling so hard to that word? Partly because the ruins themselves encourage it. You climb a pyramid at Tikal at sunrise, watch the mist roll over a canopy that looks infinite, and listen to howler monkeys doing their best horror movie sound effects. It feels like you're alone with ghosts. The fact that there's a bus parking lot and a snack stand just out of sight doesn't quite break the spell. Our brains love stories where great powers vanish dramatically, the slow, messy reality that cities emptied over generations in patterns that varied from place to place has to fight for attention. Historians still argue about whether we should even use the word collapse at all. Some say it captures the real trauma of political breakdown, famine, and migration. Others prefer transition or reorganization, words that sound like something your company would say just before reassigning half its employees. None of these labels quite fit the lived experience of people who woke up one day realizing that the king they'd grown up with was gone, the markets were thin, and their cousins had already left for a valley they said had better land. Researchers still disagree on how bad it got and for whom. Do some communities face outright hunger and violence, while others simply tilted their lives in new directions without dramatic catastrophe? The evidence suggests both happened, depending on where you look. In some places, you see signs of abrupt abandonment and burned structures. In others, you see a gentle fading, fewer fancy ceramics, humbler houses, burials that hinted people quietly hanging on even as the big monuments stopped going up. That's one of the strangest facts about the classic Maya disappearance. It doesn't look like a single story from every angle. It looks like a patchwork quilt of local stories that share some common threads: drought, deforestation, political overreach, inequality, but is stitched together differently in each region. You could write 10 different versions of this tale, focusing on 10 different cities, and each would feel a little different. So, what does it mean for us now, standing centuries later with LiDAR maps on our screens and sunscreen on our noses? First, there's the uncomfortable mirror. The classic Maya were not clueless about their environment. They were brilliant managers of water and soil. They built terraces, reservoirs, canals, and raised fields. They predicted eclipses, tracked Venus, and understood cyclical patterns in ways that still impress modern scientists. And yet, even with all that knowledge, their system strained under repeated climate shocks and constant political tension. It wasn't ignorance that hurt them. It was the combination of ecological stress and social rigidity. One popular theory suggests that their elites, locked into a political game of monument building, warfare, and status, found it hard to shift gears when the environment demanded more flexibility, less show, more adaptability. Of course, not everyone buys this story. Some scholars argue that ordinary people may have been remarkably resilient, and that the real collapse we see in stone is more about elite institutions failing than about society as a whole disintegrating. In that reading, the disappearance of kings from carved panels is less the end of the Maya and more the end of one management style, with everyday people quietly continuing life in new forms. Either way, there's a lesson there. Systems, empires, economies, even modern cities can look stable right until the moment they're not. They can be full of impressive buildings, intricate rituals, and confident speeches, while cracks are spreading under the surface, in the soil, in the water supply, in trust between leaders and the led.
The classic Maya remind us that you can't read a civilization's health just from its skyline or its Instagram feed. Second, there's the question of memory. For a long time, outside narratives treated the classic Maya as a vanished mystery, separate from the living indigenous communities in the same lands. That's changing, slowly but surely. Many of the most important projects in Maya archaeology now involve collaboration with local communities, who bring not only labor, but also their own perspectives, stories, and priorities. A carved figure that looks like data to a scientist might also be a relative, a sacred object, or a neighbor in the landscape. When a modern Maya guide stands in front of a temple and speaks in their own language about what the old ones did here, the story shifts. It's no longer just about a dead civilization that rose and fell. It's about ancestors, choices, successes, and mistakes within a story that is still being written. The so-called disappearance becomes one chapter in a much longer book. Finally, there's the feeling that hangs in the air when you leave a site. You walk back down the pyramid steps, past the ceiba tree whose roots now grip old stones, past the ball court where the echoes have changed from rubber thuds to tourist sneakers. The jungle hums in the background. A vendor sells cold drinks nearby, the ice rattling in the cooler. Life goes on, as it always does, in forms that would surprise the people who carved those glyphs. In the last stretch of our story, it's worth slowing down and letting that image settle. Stone cities, once blazing with color and sound, slowly given back to the forest. People who never stopped being Maya, even as they changed where and how they lived. Modern scientists reading mud and laser maps. Modern families speaking old languages on cell phones. The Great Disappearance turns out not to be a magic trick, but a long, human, complicated process of strain, adaptation, and survival. What remains mysterious is not whether the Maya vanished, they didn't, but how exactly each community navigated those hard centuries. Which stories were lost, and which were quietly folded into new rituals, which mistakes they recognized in time, and which they saw only in hindsight as they walked away from cracked reservoirs and faded murals. Those are the details we may never fully recover. What's clearer is the feeling the classic Maya leave us with, and blend of awe and caution. Awe at what they built, in stone, in calendars, in stories that still stare back at us from carved faces in the jungle. Caution at how even the most sophisticated cities, humming with life and ritual, can be undone when environment and power fall out of balance. If this journey through the jungle cities and their long, quiet unwinding stayed with you, if you felt the curiosity, the sadness, maybe even a strange comfort in knowing that people before us faced their own deep uncertainties, consider liking this video, subscribing, or sharing it with someone who loves mysteries. Only do it if the story truly meant something to you.